Hi everyone. I actually thought about an alternative title for this panel, and it would have been something like Chatbot War Stories or so, because I feel all of us have been in this industry for the last 3 years, pretty much ever since Facebook announced their Messenger API. And in fact, most of us met on Chatbot Summit, the very first one in Tel Aviv back then. So that's another way to think about it. But I think a big topic, as Eleanor said, or like Tom as well earlier with workflows, that we see across the board is pretty much that the development from chatbots and voice assistants has really moved from a one-person show to a team effort, right? And I think also today's presentations emphasize that quite a lot. But when working with teams, always is a question like, what tools do you actually use to work together? And that's why I'm really excited, as Alan already said, like an all-star panel today. And as a first challenge for the panel, and I've sitting on the other side many times, seeing that introductions in panels can go very, very long, usually until the end of the panel, and then it's over. You don't have questions to answer anymore. I have a challenge for everyone on the panel, which is pretty much around describing themselves and what they do in 5 words. I'm German, and I know compound words are a big thing in Germany. And so compound words are not allowed, and unfortunately, they're also not existent in English. So we'll just start here with Lauren, and then.
Open standards-based chatbot platform.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Vittorio, co-founder and CEO of Botsociety.
Nah.
Six.
That's okay.
And a compound word.
Ilker, CEO of Botanalytics.
Conversation design and prototyping. I'm Obaid.
The secret for conversational analytics is, I'm out.
Okay, thanks. Perfect. So yeah, we'll kick things off, and I'm actually just curious also to hear from your experience, because all of you have seen like tons of different chatbot and deployments and voice assistant. I know it's big, especially on the analytics side. And I'm just curious to hear like what type of different roles you see in teams that are shipping conversational AI. And I'm mostly also talking about the ones that actually ship it into production. And I'm just curious, whoever wants to start, hear your experiences.
Yeah, so we've been working with a lot of enterprise customers from all sizes and shapes. We see that projects at POC stages, you have machine learning engineers, you have software engineers, you have designers, which is a loose term, but you have like writers on it and working into prototypes, and then they expand into QA, and you have stakeholders coming in, giving feedback and being part of it. So a typical team for 5 people starts off, and then it just grows, depends on the customer and what the use cases are. And if they're tackling different platforms, then they have different engineering teams interfacing with each other and working on that.
And how big do you see them grow?
So they go up. We have the largest team that we are supporting right now is about 150 people.
Oh, wow. Okay. And do you see any like different structure within that team then, or is it just like all?
So it's different in siloed. That different could be that they have shared resources on the design side of things, but then they have siloed in development, and then QA could be shared because they want to make sure that the experience is the same across all the channels, but the development efforts could be separated out. Usually the designers are very few because they just can't find enough of them, so they are always shared resources on our end. Stakeholders range from your managers all the way to VPs and all that, depending on the level of visibility the project has. And then if they're working with third-party customers and all that, so then their stakeholder teams comes in. Approvals, legals, and all those people are coming into, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so I guess I'll jump in here. So we've been working in this ecosystem for over 3 years now, so having processed, I guess, over like 78 billion messages. And over the past 3 years, we've seen a transition from, like when we first started, it was mostly like single bot developers making a bot just to see what's happening with the, what was available and what was possible. And over the past few years, we've seen that transition now to working with larger and larger enterprises, kind of like what Obaid was mentioning. And when that happens, one of the neat discoveries was that it transitions when you make something from like an innovation team over to an actually fully operationalized application. Not only are their teams larger, like the business processes that need to be in place start to be put in. So it's not just data scientists being able to pore over all of the logs that their chatbots are generating, but it's actually content teams and writers and content designers, and the ability for the full team to have kind of a grasp of how, from my perspective, how the bot is performing and how to improve the bot is really important from like a business operational perspective, right? Yeah. So and then that's why now we're seeing job titles like conversational designer, NLP engineer. Like these are titles that we didn't see that many of 3 years ago.
Yeah, if you do a Google job search for conversational designer, it's actually a really good sense of where the market is. Almost every major company is hiring for them, and I think it's a good sign of the health of the market that we're starting to see these 70 or 150-person teams. And I think you two covered all of the roles that we typically see. They're very cross-functional teams.
Yeah, I agree. And we're starting to see even another setup, which is very interesting, where companies have a kind of a central AI team that has kind of like the core capabilities, and so all the designers there, for example, are focused on conversational AI, and they act as spin doctors for different business units across the organization who also have bot projects or AI projects, and they collaborate cross-functionally with this central kind of like team, which is kind of spearheading the expertise in the organization. And I think that for us is very exciting because it means we're moving towards a setup that allows for an organization to scale not only technical knowledge thanks to stuff like Rasa, but also design best practices and procedures. And so and the other thing that I want to touch is we see two types of users. It's like we see what we call them conversational designers, right? But mainly they arrive either from a UX background. So they used to be UX designers, and they kind of like transition there. Or, and I think some of you touched on that, they arrive from more the copywriting world. So like we had our users like used to write for screenplay for Hollywood, and now is doing conversational design. So that's also really exciting in like the way that these roles are created inside the organization.
It also depends on the case as well, because we provide both our solution as a SaaS and on-private cloud or on-prem. So when things come to the on-prem side, the security things and those kind of things are increasing, and a lot of people in that phase come to your case, and the process getting longer. But on the SaaS part, it's much more simpler. But what we see, the AI leads, data sciences, security sides come to the on-prem side, and these are mostly the deals if you are looking for the on-prem side. Yeah.
And so do you see like an increase in on-prem demand? Or?
Actually, it also depends on the case. We give analytics, and analytics is the latest part. So at the first place, you have to open the project in the company, and then you have to design the conversation flows and everything, and you have to build the bot. And in the first place, you can use simple dashboards, but in that phase, after that, you scale it up and you process millions of messages in a day, and you need an advanced analytics. And in that we are the latest phase. So I cannot compare a lot of people in the latest phase to the second phase or the first phase. So I think there are less people, but the security things and those kind of things are jumping in the latest phase.
Yeah. And does any one of you see any differences when it comes to like tools around, and I mean, I'm not so much talking about like the machine learning side, but more about like workflow tools, I guess, in the whole product management cycle between text and voice, or is there no difference, or have you seen any differences there?
I think that's a real difficult question, because we've seen companies tackling it differently. So we didn't see a big pattern. From the Botsociety point of view, you can design any type of interface. You can design for voice, for chat, but the way that the companies think about it, it really depends on the devices and the history behind kind of like each structure. I think from a design point of view, it makes a lot of sense to have a common shared, at least knowledge, if not exactly the same designers working on chat and voice, at least have a shared best practice kind of book. Because a lot of what comes out in terms of user experience has to be consistent for your customers, right? And so that you can provide that primarily through design.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of benefits of sharing, like at the very high level, like domain expertise. So we're seeing a lot of kind of domain experts being aggregated at that level to compile the knowledge bases from which like these intents are being built, right? And then at the intent level, we see customers sharing like that work, like intents and slot extraction, entity extraction, and then at the very, very final level where it's actually these experiences are being deployed, we do see some sharing across platform. But of course, every platform brings with it its own nuance as well. So you have to pick and choose where you can share your lessons. But at least at the very high level, as you get more abstracted from where the conversation is actually happening, it's definitely a good thing to do in your workflows.
Yeah, and we see that from a starting point of view, like domain expertise from business analysts, people who are not usually designers coming in. We want to take them out of the Visio and Lucid charts and Excel and Word documents and bring them into the modern world. And that sort of brings in, don't think about intents right away. There's a layer to think about that because you will figure out, okay, this is my experience for Alexa, this is my experience for Facebook Messenger, based on the content types and blocks they sort of offer you. You figure those parts out, and then you're like, okay, for me to service this particular flow, I need these intents, I need these entities, I need this data set. And that data set can be shared among different projects. And that's how we sort of enable them to design certain things in Botmock so that they are not replicating parts that they don't need to replicate. But at the same time, they are being efficient and designing the right experience for the right channel. So this is similar to what the previous life in web and mobile and different apps were, write once, deploy everywhere. Your design has to work for that particular channel first. How you deploy them, that's a whole separate problem and discussion to have. But from a designer's perspective, what works on Alexa is not going to work on Facebook Messenger, and vice versa. If you take in a flight booking experience from Facebook Messenger and replicate that to voice, it's going to be a horrible experience. So from a designer's perspective, we don't give them that freedom. We kind of restrict them on that and say, look, you really have to redesign this. You can reuse parts of it, but then follow on from there and then go and figure out what needs to be shared. And then go.
So the dialogue flow, or like not dialogue flow as in this product from Google, but the flow of the conversation is pretty much the same or like kind of similar. But then the inputs and like using different elements also as part of the conversation.
So the flow is designed for a channel first, and then they can make it more generic first and then go specific, or they can make very specific and go generic. Depends on the team and use cases, and everybody has their own processes. But then you can go either way. What a lot of designers were doing in our case, for example, when we talked to them, we would have a Word document, we're writing these scripts down. Because if you hire creative writers and say, okay, let's write some sample scripts, sample dialogues, they're going to open Word documents and just write them out. And then what a lot of platforms already are promoting, which is read out loud to each other, those things start breaking apart when you have more complex and more variety of these conversations that actually are connected now. Because you don't get the same experience. Like when you run a prototype and say, this is the text that we've written for Alexa, for example, and you run it in prototype and you hear Alexa talk back at you, you're like, this is horrible. I don't want this to be in production. That early stage feedback and loop is independent of what intents you have. And then once you figure those parts out, then you can look at this project and say, okay, these are all the artifacts that we have for every platform that you want to go for. And you don't have to design for all at once. You can design for one and then expand further. But your dev team now has much better view cross-sectionally and saying, this is what we're going to be building. What is the right tool set for us to do that? And then they can pick and choose the right tool, write pipelines, and deliver it.
Yeah, I would add that I think the good news for developers is that you don't need to be on every channel. I think people get very excited that, oh, I can reach maximum users and portability is really important. It's not. A voice experience is very different than a text experience. They don't need to port. What you need to understand is where your users are and what mode of communication is most important for them. I would say a bigger portability challenge that we hear a lot about is actually supporting multiple different languages and dealing with dialect detection. But yeah, it's definitely a different design consideration, both for different languages and different channels. But the good news is you probably don't have to support all the channels.
And I think also channels that a lot of people, like 3 years ago when this all started, haven't really thought about, right? Like especially I think of in-app messaging, which seems to be very big compared to like Facebook Messenger, which has kind of died out a bit over the last couple of years. And I'm actually curious because Lauren, Pandorabots was around before the big hype.
Yes, I almost said 15 years of war stories.
So that's super cool, and I mean, must have seen so many use cases. And I'm just curious because I mean, today we're talking about tools for teams. So what have people been doing? How did they design conversations, and how did they analyze them before all these guys were around? Because I think all of your companies have been started also around 3 years ago.
Microsoft Word. People still use it. So when we're working with an enterprise or lots of different teams, we do like to fold into the tools that they are already using as much as possible. So whatever version control systems, project management like Jira, sometimes they're analytics tools, and we used to use things like kind of like MindMap for story mapping. We have a couple of no-code GUI tools that we've introduced as well to our interface, but we do increasingly see teams adopting all of these platforms here, sitting here today. So we've had customers who will then give us their mocks for the made on Botsociety. We have a lot of people plugging into Dashbot for analytics because it really is a different consideration and a totally different format. So I think there's a lot of market demand, and we've seen organic pickup of all of these fabulous tools with people coming in to use today.
And why do you think is that? Because I mean, if I wouldn't be working in this for the last
They're
couple
free
of years,
and they work.
I would just I would just think I can just use like Photoshop to mock up some conversations, and then I would go use an Excel sheet
Photoshop.
and then maybe use Mixpanel or so for tracking. So what do you think is that?
Because it's a completely different paradigm. So we see people, actually, I would say the biggest consideration, apart from like a Photoshop or a Mixpanel or Google Analytics, is actually a Bob the Builder mentality, where enterprises are like, we're gonna build our own custom analytics system. And I'm just like, okay, come back in 6 months, and then we can talk about the pain, and then I can refer you to these tools. So these tools are very specifically optimized for the problem that they're trying to solve, which is not something that was previously solved before. But if you love Photoshop, you know, some people don't like to change. Some people love Excel spreadsheets. A TSV file full of input variations and outputs is a great way to get going with a QA bot. It's very fast. So it's kind of just whatever tools you're comfortable with using. But these set of tools are optimized for the problem at hand.
I mean, one of my favorite questions to ask customers is, where in your business process are you still using Excel? Because basically it tells me that it's a problem that is worth solving. Excel is a Swiss Army knife that does a lot of different things very okay. And you know, so I'm like, people are taking our transcript URLs and copying and pasting them into an Excel spreadsheet and then emailing that to people to look at and review them, right? So, and that tells me that where I need to kind of focus on in terms of improving my product. So I love seeing where people are using Excel.
Yeah, I want to say the same thing. When they tell me we're still in Excel, I'm like, okay, great, let's schedule 30 minutes. Like, I want to understand why Excel, because that informs us a lot. And I think, as you were saying, like, it's a fundamental shift when you switch from like the conversational interfaces to the graphical back and forth. But what we have seen at the same time is that a lot of high-level concepts are the same. So what we try to do is we try to take graphical user interface concepts and try to bring them to the conversational world. So I think, for example, in Botsociety, you can do what you see is what you get things, even though it's a conversation.
Right.
And so we try to do that kind of stuff over and over again until it works, basically.
And so where Excel fails, where we repeatedly see this, is when you have more than 3 people a part of the project, and you have people now looking at it and saying, where is the truth of this design, right? And it usually happens when, when you have the first release of the bot that goes out, and the stakeholder comes in, and they're like, okay, let's make all these changes, and those changes now go into some Excel file. And then that Excel file goes to 5 different people in emails. They make their changes with Excel, track changes, and now you have 3 different copies of it coming back. And the product manager usually is the first one to reaching out to us saying, I don't really care about everything else. All I need is everybody change this document for me, because it's everywhere now. And I have no idea what changed what, who triggered that change for me, and what do I give to the dev team? right? Whether you're giving an Excel sheet to a dev team or not, that's besides the point. It's what are you actually using to create that sheet? So Word, Excel, Visio, Lucidcharts, they work really good until that happens.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that they're using these tools before using us is because they just don't know we exist. Honestly, we're 3-year-old companies essentially. So they're comfortable with it. It's in their war chest. So they open it up and they're like, okay, that's the thing. I want to tell my developers what should be the sequence flow. Visio works, why change it? I think we've seen every tool like OneNote from Excel, OneNote, Word documents, and everything else in between.
I think the iteration process is much important because when we look at the last 3 years, especially for first 2 years, companies' projects have failed a lot because they couldn't iterate the product. So you need to iterate your product every 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks in a life cycle way, and you need to look at the analytics data, not Excel data, but you need to take action while looking at those data and improve your virtual agent. This is the main thing, and I think if it's in a repeatable way in every 2 weeks or if possible 1 week, that will be perfect.
Yeah, I'm going to get even more aggressive than that and say that the most successful bots we've seen are updated every day. And have 2 or 3 FTEs who are responsible for making those daily updates, especially if they're high volume. So at the end of the day, what we would call the bot master, because we're from the webmaster era, because yes, I'm that old, is the person who is responsible for making those daily updates needs to love the tool, and the tool needs to put them in a viral loop of doing it every day and giving them the information that they need to do it every day. That's the most important thing. Because most of the work in bot development happens after you launch when you're getting real data coming into the system.
Yeah. Cool, we have about 3 minutes, and I know it's probably not enough time to really talk in depth about challenges in the field, but I think mostly on like how all those different tools work together, like where do you see the biggest challenge at the moment?
Yeah, I think the format is a challenge. So yeah, I want to talk with you about that next week, actually.
We should all talk about that. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, so like how do we set up a standard of format so that like it's seamless the way that different teams are inside the same organization, but also across different organizations share conversational structures, and that is not straightforward. So. But I think the moment that we solve that, then it can unlock a lot of progress, collective progress.
So almost like you have in HTML, you have like paragraphs and then stuff like that. So H1, H2, and so that's what you mean with format, I guess. Also like the same name for intents and yeah.
Exactly, yeah, and how they connect with each other, because that's the complicated thing. And, yeah.
Design iterations, knowing what to build. That's the biggest problem. I think a lot of projects die because it was driven into this whim of, oh, let's build a bot, and they went the engineering route first, nothing against engineering route, but you end up not knowing what to build. It's like building a mobile app, you end up having 15 buttons because you were like, oh, this is also cool, and then before you know it, it's like, oh, let's just scratch this out. So design iterations are the biggest problem.
I think education is the most critical thing because they are educated to tools, design tools, conversation design tools, conversation analytics tools, a lot of other different tools. When you look at 4 years ago, there were no conversation designers. So right now, there are a lot.
Yeah, I mean, from what I'm seeing, like the complexity of these conversational interfaces is the biggest challenge. Unlike designing a mobile app, if someone doesn't click your button, you don't hear them swearing at you, right? So that's not part of the data that you're getting.
Which is probably good sometimes.
Right, so it's good and bad, right? So then the second problem then is great. Now that you can see everyone trying to do the thing that you're like, it used to be just push that button. I was sitting in like UI groups sitting like, please push the button. They never push the button. Now you can actually read along with people and see like the frustrations that they're expressing to your application. So now you're taking that language and aggregating that into better training data, which is awesome about this ecosystem, is that you can use your customers' words and teach your bots and your interfaces. And then now, as we're getting larger and larger teams making more and more edits to a bigger and bigger model, we're starting to see problems like version control. And changing one part of the model affects another part that you didn't understand, that you didn't realize was going to happen as, now that we have probabilistic models, it's not exact, right? So I didn't mean to change, I didn't touch that intent, but why did it all of a sudden start hitting, right?
Yeah.
So those are some of the challenges that we're helping our customers figure out, because it's more complicated, right?
Yeah.
With a more powerful system, you get more complicated interactions with which to design.
Takes 150 people also, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes. Do you have any more thoughts on that, Lauren, in terms of like challenges that you've seen?
I have 2 hours worth of
Yeah.
thoughts. We're at a 0 timer, so we can.
You have 5 words
I'm
again.
going to be here all day if you want to come find me and complain about what's hard.
Cool. I think that's a great closing. Thank you so much for joining. I think all of you will be here for the happy hour as well afterwards. And just grill everyone on the challenges, and that's what we are here for. Thank you.